about to tell you something that still makes me want to throw my phone across the room every time I think about it. And trust me, I think about it way more than I should. Madison, 23, and apparently the villain in everyone else's twisted version of this story. So, there I was, scrolling through Bumble like every other girl, trying to find someone decent in this wasteland of weirdos and guys who think sending photos of their junk counts as conversation. Most of these dudes were either broke, boring, or had the personality of wet cardboard. But then this guy, Micah, pops up and actually seems different. 27. Decent job from what I could tell. And get this, he actually waited like 3 weeks before asking me out, which honestly made me think he might actually be serious about getting to know me instead of just trying to hook up. We'd been texting back and forth, and he seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say, asking about my work and my hobbies, not just sending those stupid, hey, beautiful messages that make me want to block someone immediately. When he finally suggested we meet up, he picked this really nice Italian place downtown that I'd actually been wanting to try, but could never justify spending that much money on myself. I'm thinking, okay, finally a guy who knows how to treat a woman and isn't going to suggest we split a coffee and call it a date. But here's the thing, and I don't care how this sounds. I've had some really awful experiences with guys from dating apps, and I'm talking about situations that left me feeling unsafe and honestly a little traumatized. There was this one guy who seemed perfectly normal online, but turned into a complete creep the second we met in person, following me to my car and making comments about what he wanted to do to me that made my skin crawl. Another time, this dude straight up lied about everything in his profile and spent the entire date trying to pressure me into going back to his place, getting increasingly aggressive when I kept saying no. So yeah, I developed some anxiety around meeting strangers from the internet. And honestly, anyone who has a problem with that clearly doesn't understand what it's like to be a woman trying to date in this crazy world. Stella, my best friend since college, totally gets it because she's been through similar stuff. And we've always had each other's backs when it comes to dating safety. She's the one person I trust completely. And we've always said we'd help each other out in sketchy situations. So, when Micah suggested this expensive restaurant, I knew I wanted to go, but I also knew I'd feel way more comfortable having Stella there to back me up in case he turned out to be another weirdo. I thought about it for like a day, going back and forth in my head about whether to ask. But finally, I just decided to be honest about my anxiety and see how he responded. When I brought up the idea of Stella coming along for safety reasons, I explained it really carefully, making sure he understood that it wasn't about not trusting him specifically, but just about me feeling more secure in general. I told him about some of my bad experiences without going into too much detail, and I made it clear that Stella would basically just be there as backup in case anything felt off. What really surprised me was how quickly he said yes. Like he didn't even have to think about it, which honestly made me feel like he really understood where I was coming from and respected my boundaries. Most guys would have gotten defensive or tried to convince me I didn't need protection, but he was just like, sure, whatever makes you feel comfortable. I remember feeling so relieved and thinking, maybe I'd actually found one of the good ones who gets what women go through and doesn't take it personally when we need to be careful. Stella was totally on board when I told her, and we spent like 2 hours getting ready together, doing our makeup, and picking out outfits that would look good, but not too desperate. We were both excited because this place had been on our list forever. And honestly, it felt kind of nice to have a legitimate reason to finally check it out without having to spend our own money on overpriced pasta. The night of the date, Stella and I both showed up looking absolutely amazing. And I could tell right away that Micah was not expecting what he got. He was standing outside the restaurant looking all nervous and fidgety, which honestly should have been my first red flag that maybe he wasn't as confident as his texts made him seem. When he saw both of us walking up, his face went through like 3 different expressions in the span of 2 seconds. And I could practically see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to figure out what was happening. I introduced Stella as my friend who'd be joining us. Keeping my tone super casual like this was the most normal thing in the world, which it should have been if he was actually serious about making me feel comfortable. But instead of just rolling with it, he immediately started asking all these questions about the logistics. Like, where was Stella going to sit and how was this supposed to work exactly? I'm thinking to myself, dude, just go with the flow and stop making this weird. But he kept pressing the issue like he needed some kind of detailed explanation for why my friend was there. Stella jumped in to explain that she was basically just there for moral support and to make sure I felt safe. But this guy starts getting all technical about it, asking if she was planning to participate in the conversation or just sit there silently. Like what kind of question is that? Obviously, she's going to talk if we're all sitting at the same table, but the way he said it made it sound like he thought we were trying to trick him somehow. When we finally got seated, the hostess was looking at us funny too, probably because most people don't bring a third wheel to their dates, but I figured that was her problem, not mine. Micah kept glancing around the restaurant like he was embarrassed, which honestly started to annoy me, because if he was really okay with this arrangement, like he said, why was he acting so uncomfortable? The whole vibe felt off from the beginning, and I started wondering if maybe I'd misjudged him. And he was actually one of those guys who says one thing but means another. When the waiter came over to take our drink orders, that's when things really started to go sideways, because Micah directly asked Stella if she was planning to order food and who was paying for her meal. I couldn't believe he actually said it out loud like that in front of the waiter and everything, making this huge deal about money when he's the one who suggested this expensive place in the first place. Stella got defensive, which I totally understood because he was basically calling her a freeloader to her face. And she told him that she was part of the date arrangement that I'd already discussed with him. But instead of just accepting that and moving on, he started arguing with both of us about what he'd actually agreed to and how he never said he'd pay for 3 people. I'm sitting there thinking, are you seriously going to humiliate us in public over the cost of one extra meal when you specifically chose a place this expensive? The whole thing was so awkward and uncomfortable, and I could feel other people starting to stare at our table because our voices were getting louder. That's when Micah really showed his true colors by standing up and announcing that this whole situation was ridiculous and he wasn't going to participate in whatever game we were playing. He actually used the word game like we were trying to scam him or something, which was so insulting, I couldn't even process it at first. Before I could even respond, he was walking toward the exit, leaving me and Stella sitting there with our mouths hanging open and the waiter still standing there waiting for our order. The worst part was how he handled it, just abandoning us without any consideration for how embarrassing that would be or how we were supposed to get home or pay for our own meals when we hadn't planned for that. After Micah stormed out like some kind of dramatic child, Stella and I just sat there for a minute trying to process what had just happened to us. The waiter was still hovering nearby, looking uncomfortable, and I could feel every person in that restaurant staring at our table like we were some kind of entertainment for their evening. I was so mortified. I wanted to disappear, but I was also absolutely furious at how Micah had treated us, like we were criminals for wanting to feel safe on a date. Stella was the first one to speak up, and she was livid, saying she couldn't believe what a jerk he'd turned out to be and how he'd basically humiliated us in front of everyone. We ended up ordering anyway because we were already there. And honestly, the food looked amazing, but having to pay for our own expensive meals just added insult to injury after everything he'd put us through. While we were eating, we kept talking about how crazy the whole situation was and how he'd completely overreacted to something that should have been no big deal. I mean, we'd explained everything up front. He'd agreed to it. And then he acted like we'd ambushed him with some shocking surprise. Stella pointed out that any decent guy would have just gone with it and tried to make the best of the situation, even if it wasn't what he'd originally planned. But instead, he chose to make a scene and embarrass us. I started thinking about all the red flags I should have noticed earlier, like how he'd taken so long to ask me out in the first place, which probably meant he was indecisive and couldn't handle unexpected situations. By the time we finished our meals, I'd convinced myself that I'd actually dodged a major bullet with this guy. Because if he couldn't handle one simple accommodation for my anxiety, what would he be like if we ever had to deal with real relationship challenges? When I got home that night, I was still so worked up about the whole thing that I couldn't sleep, just replaying the entire disaster over and over in my head. The more I thought about it, the more angry I got because he'd not only wasted my time and money, but he'd also made me feel stupid for trying to protect myself in a perfectly reasonable way. I decided he needed to face some consequences for treating us like that. So, I started crafting posts about the experience that would let other women know what kind of person he really was. I made sure to include all the important details about how he'd agreed to my safety arrangements and then went back on his word, leaving two young women stranded at an expensive restaurant without any way to pay. The response was immediate and mostly supportive, with tons of my friends and followers commenting about what a loser he was and how I deserved so much better. Some people shared their own horror stories about guys who'd pulled similar stunts, which made me feel validated that this was actually a pattern of bad male behavior, not just an isolated incident. A few people asked questions about why I brought a friend in the first place, but I shut that down pretty quickly by explaining about my anxiety and past bad experiences with online dating. I also made sure to post about it in a couple of dating groups where other women could see it and maybe avoid making the same mistake I did by trusting him. The whole experience really opened my eyes to how many men out there are just pretending to be decent until they get the chance to show their true colors. And I felt like it was my responsibility to warn other women about what to watch out for. What I didn't tell everyone in those posts was that this definitely wasn't my first time bringing Stella along on dates. And honestly, it had worked out pretty well for both of us in the past. We developed this whole system where we'd take turns being each other's backup on first dates, especially when the guys suggested expensive places or seemed like they might be too good to be true. I know some people might think that's weird, but we saw it as being smart and protecting ourselves in a world where men constantly disappoint you or turn out to be completely different from their online personas. Stella and I had been doing this for almost a year, and most of the time the guys were totally cool with it once we explained the safety aspect. Sure, sometimes they seemed a little confused or caught off guard, but the decent ones would adjust and try to make the best of it. And honestly, those were the ones worth seeing again anyway. The guys who got weird about it or made a big deal out of the money were clearly showing their true colors early, which saved us from wasting more time on them later. I'd kept track of all our successful group dates in my phone, and we'd actually had some really fun evenings where everyone got along great, and the conversation flowed naturally between all three of us. There were even a few times where the guy ended up asking both of us to hang out again as friends, which proved that it could work perfectly fine when everyone was mature about it. My sister had made some comments about our strategy during family dinner a few weeks before the Micah incident, asking if I thought it was fair to the guys, or if maybe I should consider just doing coffee dates first instead. I shut that down pretty quickly because she's always been jealous of how easily things come to me. And she's never understood that being attractive and knowing your worth means you don't have to settle for cheap dates or uncomfortable situations. When I explained to her that we were actually helping these men by testing whether they could handle real-world relationship challenges and unexpected situations, she just rolled her eyes like she always does when I'm being logical about dating strategy. The truth is, most guys our age are either broke, selfish, or completely clueless about how to treat women properly. So, having a system that weeds out the losers early is actually doing everyone a favor. After the Micah disaster, I started being even more upfront about my requirements when talking to guys on dating apps, making it clear that I needed to feel completely comfortable and safe before meeting someone new. Some guys would unmatch me immediately when I mentioned potentially bringing a friend, which was honestly perfect because it showed they weren't serious about actually getting to know me as a person. The ones who stuck around and seemed understanding were the ones worth pursuing. Even though none of them ended up being as promising as Micah had seemed before he showed his true nature, I started noticing that more and more guys were suggesting or lunch dates instead of dinner, which felt like they were trying to cheap out or avoid the friend situation entirely. This was so frustrating because it meant I was having to waste my time on low effort dates that didn't really show me what kind of provider or partner these men would be in a real relationship. About 3 months after the Micah situation, I matched with this guy, Landon, who seemed completely different from anyone I'd been talking to lately. His profile showed him at nice restaurants and events. He had a decent job in some kind of business field. And most importantly, he immediately suggested dinner at this upscale steakhouse when we moved off the app. I was honestly shocked because it had been so long since someone had proposed a real date instead of coffee or drinks, and I was starting to think all the good guys had given up on proper courtship. When I brought up my usual safety arrangement about bringing Stella along, Landon's response was totally unexpected. He actually laughed and said that sounded fun, like he was genuinely excited about meeting my friend too. This was so different from the usual hesitation or awkward questions that I started wondering if maybe he was just more confident and socially comfortable than the other guys I'd been dealing with. He asked a few questions about Stella, like what she did for work and what kind of stuff she was interested in, which I thought was sweet because it showed he wanted to make sure she felt included in the conversation. The more we texted leading up to the date, the more impressed I became with how mature and understanding he seemed about the whole situation. He even suggested we make a reservation for 3 people right away, which showed he was taking it seriously and planning ahead instead of just going along with it reluctantly. On the night of the date, Stella and I spent extra time getting ready because we both wanted to make a good impression on someone who seemed like he might actually be worth our time. I picked out this dress that I'd been saving for a special occasion, and Stella wore this amazing outfit that always makes her look incredible because we figured if he was taking us somewhere expensive, we should look the part. When we got to the restaurant, Landon was already waiting at the bar. And I have to admit, he looked even better in person than in his photos, which doesn't happen very often with dating app guys. He stood up to greet us both with hugs, which felt natural and confident, and he complimented both of our outfits without being creepy about it. During dinner, he was incredibly charming and engaging, asking us both questions about our lives and careers, sharing funny stories from his own work, and making sure the conversation never got awkward or one-sided. What really impressed me was how he seemed genuinely interested in Stella's opinions and experiences, not just politely tolerating her presence like some guys had done in the past. He ordered wine for the table without even checking the prices. And when our entree came, everything was absolutely delicious and clearly expensive. I was starting to think I'd finally found someone who understood how dating should work and who had the financial means to back up his interest in getting to know me properly. But as the evening went on, I started noticing that he and Stella were really clicking in a way that made me slightly uncomfortable, even though I couldn't put my finger on exactly why. They had similar tastes in music and movies. They both loved traveling to the same types of places, and they kept making each other laugh in this easy, natural way that honestly made me feel a little left out. When Landon excused himself to take a work call, Stella immediately started gushing about how attractive and interesting she thought he was, which caught me completely off guard because she'd never shown that kind of interest in any of my dates before. I tried to laugh off Stella's comments about Landon, reminding her that she was supposed to be there for my safety, not to scope out my date for herself, but she just smiled and said she was just appreciating that I'd finally found someone worth my time, which didn't really make me feel better about the whole situation. When Landon came back from his call, the dynamic felt different somehow. Like there was this energy between him and Stella that hadn't been there before. Or maybe I just hadn't noticed it earlier. The rest of dinner went smoothly enough, with Landon picking up the check without even hesitating, which I appreciated because it showed he was serious about making a good impression. As we were leaving the restaurant, he suggested we should definitely do this again soon. But the way he said it felt more directed at both of us than specifically at me. When he asked for both of our numbers, he explained it as wanting to coordinate future plans since we'd all gotten along so well, which seemed reasonable enough at the time. Over the next few days, I kept waiting for Landon to text me about setting up another date, but his messages were mostly just casual conversation and funny memes, nothing that felt like he was actively pursuing me romantically. I started wondering if maybe he was just being respectful and taking things slow, or if he was one of those guys who needed constant encouragement to make a move. What I didn't know was that he'd been texting Stella constantly, and they'd already made plans to meet up for coffee that weekend, just the two of them. I only found out when Stella mentioned it casually while we were getting our nails done, acting like it was no big deal, and she was just being friendly. When I asked her what exactly they'd talked about, that required a whole separate hangout. She got defensive and said they'd connected over some shared interests, and he'd asked if she wanted to explore the city together. I couldn't believe what I was hearing because this was supposed to be my date, my connection. And she was supposed to be there for support, not to steal my potential boyfriend. But when I tried to explain how inappropriate this was, Stella turned it around on me, saying that I was the one who'd established that group dates were totally normal and healthy. So why was I suddenly having a problem with them continuing to be friends? She reminded me that I brought her on dates specifically to help evaluate guys. And her opinion was that Landon was great and deserved to be with someone who appreciated him, which felt like a direct insult to me. The worst part was how she acted like this was all perfectly innocent, and I was being crazy for feeling betrayed when she knew exactly what she was doing by encouraging his attention and making plans behind my back. I tried to get her to cancel the coffee date, explaining that it was completely disrespectful to our friendship and to the whole arrangement we'd had going, but she refused and said I was being possessive over someone I barely knew. That coffee date turned into a whole day together, and then another date. And within 2 weeks, Stella and Landon were officially seeing each other, posting pictures together like they'd been a couple for months. I found out through social media like everyone else, which was honestly the most humiliating part of this entire situation because it made me look like I had no idea what was happening in my own friend's life. When I confronted Stella about it, she had the nerve to act like this was all perfectly natural, and I should be happy for her, since I was always talking about wanting her to find someone good. She explained that Landon had specifically asked her out after their coffee hangout, telling her that he'd realized during our group dinner that she was more his type, and he was more interested in getting to know her than me. According to Stella, he'd apparently been planning this the whole time, using our dinner as an opportunity to evaluate both of us and decide which one he wanted to pursue, which was just disgusting and manipulative, if you ask me. But the absolute worst part was finding out that Landon had actually heard about our dating strategy through some mutual friends who knew about the Micah incident, and he'd specifically sought us out to prove some kind of point. Stella showed me screenshots of their early conversations, where he'd basically admitted that he'd wanted to see what would happen if he gave us exactly what we thought we wanted, an expensive dinner with no questions asked, and then chose the friend over the actual date. He'd told her that he'd been curious about whether we were genuinely using the friend system for safety or if we were just looking for free meals, and our behavior at dinner had given him his answer. This was absolutely devastating because it meant that everything that was genuine interest and mature understanding was actually him playing some kind of sick game with our feelings. But even worse than his manipulation was how Stella had gone along with it, allowing herself to be used as a pawn in his weird social experiment instead of staying loyal to our friendship. When I tried to explain to her how betrayed I felt and how this violated everything our friendship was supposed to stand for, she just shrugged and said that maybe I should consider why my dating strategy kept backfiring on me. She suggested that if I stopped trying to manipulate situations and just focused on making genuine connections, I might have better luck finding someone who actually wanted to be with me for the right reasons. I couldn't believe she was lecturing me about manipulation when she'd literally stolen my date and was now trying to make it sound like it was somehow my fault for not being interesting enough to keep his attention. The betrayal cut so deep because Stella had been my closest friend for years. The one person I'd trusted completely, and she'd thrown away our entire relationship for some guy she'd known for 2 weeks. Watching their relationship develop over social media was torture because he was treating her exactly the way I'd always wanted to be treated. Expensive dates, romantic gestures, public displays of affection, and genuine effort to make her happy. They looked so perfect together in all their photos, and everyone was commenting about what a cute couple they made and how lucky Stella was to find someone so wonderful. Meanwhile, I was left completely alone, having lost both a potential boyfriend and my best friend in one devastating blow, with no one to blame but the two selfish people who decided their happiness was more important than my feelings or our friendship. If this confession kept you hooked, make sure to subscribe, like, and share. We share powerful true stories every day that explore the complex realities of life.